Okay, hi everybody. I'm reading from my book on the ancient Greeks and disinformation. This is chapter 2, and it's the section on the function of deception beyond self enrichment. So the last section was on the biological basis of rhetoric. We talked about George Kennedy and his work in comparative rhetoric, in which he proposes the theory that all communication is related to the conservation of energy. It's it's one theory. It's useful primarily just for tying together the fields of biology and rhetoric. I don't think that Kennedy's theory is a full account of the origins of language or the origins of rhetoric, but it's just a step in the right direction at looking at the right time scale. He's one of the first scholars that I came across, at least historically in the rhetorical tradition, that tries to unite evolutionary biology with rhetoric. He's not the only, but he's a seminal thinker in my field, and so I found this quite exciting. So that's Kennedy's work on comparative rhetoric establishes something like an interdisciplinary connection between evolutionary biology, the conservation of energy of an organism, and the use of language. But now, why do we lie? Why do organizations lie? Individuals deceive at a scale that's larger than the individual. And so, for example, international geopolitics. What does Russia gain from investing massive amounts of resources in disinformation and so on? Some of that is tied to self interest, Putin's self interest, or the self interest of those around him, the interest of those around him. So it does ultimately distill down to individual organisms, but it's also occurring at the interest of these large corporations, private entities, public entities. Okay, so this is the function of deception beyond self enrichment. In other words, deception at a scale that is larger than the individual. The purpose of deception is not always limited to personal gain. Sometimes we lie to ourselves to make sense just of the horrifying position we find ourselves in as humans. We tell ourselves stories to comfort ourselves, for example, and comfort others. It's not easy being an animal on a rock hurling through space, trying to make sense of a noisy, busy world with so many competing interests and fast paced deadlines, obligations, and so on and so on. But lying is not just something children do when they want to get their way. Kids' lies might seem more obvious to us because we know when they're absolutely false. We might ask a 5-year old, "Did you eat the rest of the cookies from the plate in the kitchen?" And through a mouthful of crumbs, they'll say, "No, it wasn't me." Very confidently, too, will they say this. We ask them then, "Oh, it sounds like you're eating something. What are you eating right now?" And they say, "Nothing." There's a kind of humor to this sort of lie because it's so blatant, it's so obvious, and everyone in that situation knows it. Um, but we think we can spot lies like this everywhere, but most lies are not like this, are not so blatantly obvious. It's harder to know when something is a lie, especially when it is carefully crafted and persuasively sold to us, and especially through layers and layers of complex digital technologies, proprietary algorithms. I mean, top scientists at Facebook designing these platforms based on human psychology and behavior research. There's a lot stacked against an individual there. We give too much credence to stories and allow ourselves to be worked over by lies when we want to believe them, such as when some politician claims to value the working and middle class, while in reality they may do little to nothing to try to better the quality of life for everyday citizens. Not long ago, a German World War I veteran persuaded millions of Germans to build hundreds of work and death camps to enslave and torture and murder millions of people. The narrative that Hitler sold to the German people was that Jewish people were responsible for the country's downfall. That's a vague, difficult to prove proposition. that vilified an entire group of people, many groups of people, really. It was perfect propaganda to motivate a country to commit horrendous atrocities. Propaganda works that way. If we don't stop to think critically about propaganda, then what's been said can, on the surface, seem to make a lot of sense. Consider slogans like save the planet or support our troops. It's hard for either a liberal or a conservative to take an opposing view to either of those positions. Who wouldn't want to save the planet and who doesn't support our troops? It's the right thing to do. That's the insidious beauty of propaganda. What, you don't want to save our planet? How could you not want to save the planet? It's hard to argue with that, right? These are effective propaganda slogans because they can be used for almost anything. We can ask people to support our troops for either a just or an unjust war. We can ask people to save the planet in supporting a bill that would, in reality, have no tangible benefit to slowing global warming. These types of propaganda slogans stir our emotions. There's pathos from Aristotle again. They stir our emotions and get us excited. But they are worse than meaningless because they cloud our judgment and stop us from analyzing the positions, propositions, proposals, and policies, the reality that lies beneath them. What's really happening behind the veil. When you lift up the propaganda slogan, what is really trying to be promoted to you? That's the question to ask. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, who was also a student of Plato, helps us unravel slogan-based propaganda statements. The underlying logic of these slogans is fairly simple. When a politician flies the banner of support our troops, our minds naturally fill in the rest of the logic. The syllogism looks something like this. Now I'll slow down there for a moment. Syllogism is a logical construction. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It's the transitive property of equality in mathematics. It's a kind of just beautiful, self-evident, axiomatic, logical proposition. If one thing is equal to the next thing, and the next thing is equal to a third thing, then the first thing must be equal to the third thing. It's widely useful, and our minds seem to just naturally snap into it. I don't know if that's nature or nurture. I don't know if that's, look at Piaget's developmental psychology. There are certain concepts that humans just seem to developmentally at a certain age grasp. It could be something like that, or it could just be something that we're taught. It's not clear to me where we all get that, but it's something that's innately understood by everyone or nearly everyone. Nearly everyone. And so this is then the syllogism that I'm using. We can think about a simple logical constructions like that to tease out the arguments behind advertising, behind propaganda. Happy people drink Coca-Cola. You are a person, you want to be happy. Therefore, you should drink Coca-Cola. That's a little bit of a messy one, but it's something like that. And then the enthymeme that Aristotle presents is you take out one of the propositions, take out some portion of that syllogism. You can take out different elements of it for different effects. And then the mind naturally fills in those gaps in the logic because we naturally have that inclination towards that type of logical structure. Some example here from the book. Here's a syllogism torn from the slogan, support our troops. Proposition 1, people should always do what is right. Proposition 2, supporting our troops is the right thing to do. Our conclusion then, therefore, I should support our troops. That naturally comes to us. We don't even have to think it. It's filled in by the slogan of propaganda. It's hard to argue with that logic, too. It's a solid little statement of logic. But when we break down the actual policies or the propositions underneath these types of slogans, we start to see where we err, where we make mistakes in our thinking. The proposition B or 2 is where the politician is attempting to persuade us. It's very hard to argue against proposition A in the syllogism. People should always do what is right. That's just a kind of self-evident truth. It's almost a meaningless statement in itself. It requires so much more, but people should always do what is right. That seems agreeable at a kind of basic ethical level. There are some outlying circumstances, perhaps, and we could open that up to dialogue and should be opened up to dialogue. But it's proposition B that's really troubling here because B is so vague, so nearly meaningless. What does support even mean? And which troops and for which cause? And should we support the soldiers who commit the war crimes, murder civilians? Most of us would not support those particular actions. Should we support the invasion of another country unquestioningly just because of the logic of this syllogism? That's what those in power would like you to do. If we reconfigure the syllogism from the perspective of the speaker or politician, we get closer to the truth of what is happening. Let's imagine they were speaking honestly to us, and then I rewrite the syllogism as if it were being honestly spoken from a political figure. Proposition A, I believe invading Afghanistan is the right decision to make. B, proposition 2, we should always support our troops. Therefore, the conclusion, if you support our troops, then you should support the invasion of Afghanistan. We have translated the nonsensical logic of what the politician is saying into a more honest statement of what they're trying to convey. When we lay it out like this, it makes no sense to us. There are complicated reasons for staging an invasion into another country. I want support from the public for many complicated reasons too, including re-election. This is from the perspective of the politician. Rather than tell you about the debatable, contestable, complicated factors that are involved in this problem, I shall shift the focus away from the policy and onto the soldiers. So support our troops, even if my policies and decisions are no good for you. That's the honest politician, right? I'm diverting your attention to some propaganda message or slogan while the actual policy making underneath is obscured. And if political leaders were truly honest, they would tell us about their investments in the military industrial complex and how much they might personally stand to gain financially through a military conflict. Bad logic and bad reasoning accounts for many of our belief systems. It's incredibly unfortunate because in our complicated social and economic systems, we need to outsource tasks and specialize. Some people need to focus entirely on being excellent medical providers, keep up with the latest medical literature, conduct research, and help keep us healthy. We need people with backgrounds in physics and engineering to build bridges. People who specialize then in the construction of specific parts of those bridges and factories that manufacture the tools that are used, whole systems of technologies. You wouldn't want the architect holding the welding torch, and you wouldn't want the welder in charge of securing financing for the project. That's specialization. It takes many, many, many people and systems to build a bridge. Through the system of distributed specialization, we're forced to place our trust in others. That's hard to do since we often misplace our trust. Yet the very basis of complex social, economic, and governmental systems resides in our ability to trust other people. Noam Chomsky tells us of the role of propaganda in the United States in the 1930s after the passing of the, I think, Wagner Act. I'm used to saying that as Wagner for the composer, but I think this is the Wagner Act, a major legislative victory that gave workers the right to organize. Chomsky writes that in that decade, big businesses relied heavily on public relations strategies to attempt to curtail the progress of labor organizers, including concerted action by the National Association of Manufacturers and the Business Roundtable. Now, I quote Chomsky here. Excuse me. The first trial was 1 year later in 1937. There was a major strike, the steel strike in western Pennsylvania, Johnstown. Business tried out a new technique of labor destruction, which worked very well. Not through goon squads and breaking knees, that wasn't working very well anymore, but through the more subtle and effective means of propaganda. The idea was to figure out ways to turn the public against the strikers, to present the strikers as disruptive, harmful to the public, and against the common interests. And if that doesn't sound like something that's still a strategy that's still employed today, the idea was, Chomsky writes, the idea was to figure out ways to turn the public against the strikers, to present the strikers, the workers, as disruptive, harmful to the public, and against common interests when it couldn't be more far from the truth. The propaganda message that the corporate interests came up with was about harmony and Americanism. They tried to paint the strikers as being disruptive and breaking that harmony and union of American patriotism. We should all try to work together. We shouldn't be striking. Even though those were the laborers producing the steel that would be needed to bolster the United States into and leading up to World War II, which then provided so much prosperity in the post-war era. It's hard to fight against propaganda like that. Who wants to be considered anti-American? The message was effective, and public perception started change against the workers, against those workers who were on strike. As Chomsky writes, it was later called the Mohawk Valley Formula, and it was applied over and over to break strikes. They were called scientific methods of strike breaking, and worked very effectively by mobilizing community opinion in favor of vapid, empty concepts like Americanism. End quote there from Chomsky. The more abstract the messaging, the more powerful it can be, the more widely it can spread when it comes to propaganda. It's hard to argue against abstract values like justice and patriotism. We've seen a similar phenomenon in the spread of COVID-19 anti-vaccination misinformation. Despite the vaccine being demonstrably safe and incredibly effective at slowing the spread of transmission, mis and disinformation surrounding the vaccine was quickly and widely disseminated on social media. In May of 2020, NPR reported that researchers at Carnegie Mellon University had found that 45% of the Twitter accounts spreading disinformation were automated bots rather than actual human users of Twitter at the time, now X. Researchers called this, quoting now from the study, researchers culled through more than 200 million tweets discussing the virus since January and found that about 45% were sent by accounts that behave more like computerized robots than humans. It's too early to say conclusively which individuals or groups are behind the bot accounts, but researchers said the tweets appeared aimed at sowing division in America. In an interview with NPR, Carnegie Mellon computer science professor Kathleen Carley suggested that we do know that it looks like it's a propaganda machine, and it definitely matches the Russian and Chinese playbooks, but it would take a tremendous amount of resources to substantiate that. It's a difficult claim to provide direct evidence for a nebulous and distant cyber attack. It may not be traceable. They've may gone to great lengths to obscure any hint of traceability. It's hard to combat disinformation when it's being spread by non-human actors at great speeds, replicating like a virus itself. And I don't know the pronunciation precisely on this, the Russian individual, Alexander Dugin, I think, or maybe Dugin, wrote an ideographical manual, The Foundations of Geopolitics, the Geopolitical Future of Russia. in which he suggests that Russia's strategy against the US should be to sow disorder and confusion and fuel instability. The book has been used as a training manual and ideological grounding point for Russian leaders since its publication in 1997. He writes that Russia should introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encouraging all kinds of separatism and ethnic, social, and racial conflict, supporting all dissident movements, extremist, racist, sectarian groups, thus destabilizing internal political processes in the US. Any of that sound familiar? When we, when we return to thinking about George Kennedy's rendering of rhetoric as a natural method of self preservation, a sort of biological communicative impulse, then we can see why such a seemingly nefarious global policy would make sense for one country against another. In fact, American propaganda is some of the most entrenched and effective propaganda in the world. Chomsky writes, usually the population is pacifist, just like during the First World War. The public sees no reason to get involved in foreign adventures, killing, and torture. So you have to rile them up, you have to whip them up, Chomsky writes. And that does seem to be the case for much of American history, that we are more centrist than extremist, and thus propaganda for the stoking of the emotions. And that's precisely what United States leaders did to promote American involvement in the First World War in Europe and to engineer public opinion to support their policy. Though it's an overly simplistic analogy, in this Kennedyan, Kennedy, George Kennedyan, communication as biological conservation of energy interpretation, that is, through the theory of Kennedy, a country is somewhat like an animal in its conservation of energy. The leaders of a country make a decision the public does not support. They are in power and believe they have made the best decision, despite the complete lack sometimes of public support. So those in power use communication technologies and strategies to shift and change public opinion. Remember Bitzer saying rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, changing the reality, what the worldview, the perspectives and opinions of entire populations sometimes, or large enough swaths of population to influence outcomes, social outcomes. Time and again, it works. Whether it is propaganda to stoke patriotic fervor in support of a war, or foreign governments sowing division with disinformation, we are always incredibly susceptible to lies and we are easily persuaded. Remember the beginning of chapter 2, we're talking about how persuadable we are, so easily persuaded, and always have been, and probably always will be. The animals in power want to stay in power. The country in power wants to stay in power. Self-preservation. And so, people will lie to get what they want. But here's the rub. We can clearly see this is not democratic. This is not rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is the elite and the powerful influencing the masses for particular purposes. And in order to combat this phenomenon, we must become aware of how these systems are affecting us now, not just through old traditional media like radio and television, but also through social media, new means and methods of transmitting information, which are not auxiliary, they're primary. More money being spent on digital information, digital advertising, than all other forms combined of traditional media. A government that persuades its citizens to vote a particular way is not a purely democratic government. An economy in which billions of dollars are spent lying and persuading its consumers is not a free market. And a school system that does not teach students about these dangers is not providing our children and future citizens a full, proper education. If we should value the truth we should value the truth above all else, if only for the reason that it creates a stronger, more honest democracy. And democracy might be one of the only things on earth truly worth fighting for freedom of mind, freedom of expression. For Chomsky, that's what it means to be human, the freedom to create, to think. So, don't let yourself be one of the persuadables. Fortify yourself against lies and deception. Be critical. Ask questions such as, should I trust this article? What are the credentials of this blog? Who targeted me with this video advertisement and why did they do it? Who paid for this ad? Does this person have the requisite education or training to be speaking on this topic with such confidence? The answer is usually no. No. What is the substance of the arguments themselves you can analyze? These are tough questions. You won't always have the answers, but it's better to ask. The very method of philosophy, the art of asking questions, the very art of rhetoric, untangling how the answers are constructed. It's better to ask these questions and to consider these elements of persuasion than to be misled and misdirected by the powers of others. It's an age-old lesson. Think for yourself. After all, Abraham Lincoln warned us of the dangers that can crop up inside our own nations. Sometimes we have more to fear from ourselves. In his speech, The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, Lincoln addresses this subject at the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, on January 27th, 1838. And now Lincoln's words. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. That's Abraham Lincoln in 1837, an oft quoted speech. The rhetoric of which would be fun to analyze it at some point. Powerful writing. There's a wonderful story in one of the public domain Abraham Lincoln biographies where a professor of rhetoric sort of chases down Lincoln and he wants to talk with him for an hour and figure out how he became such a great speaker and such a great writer. And the story, which may be apocryphal, goes something like Lincoln agrees to meet with him and he listens to the professor, and then Lincoln says, oh, rhetoric, is that what you call it? I didn't realize. I've been doing it all this time and I didn't know. It's kind of funny because that is what it's like sometimes, right? Is you don't need to name it to see it and understand it, and it's that embodied art. And Lincoln was a great orator, a great storyteller. There's some other fun tidbits from that book. Apparently, Lincoln did not read much as a young man, but read some very specific books, had a kind of tiny sliver, but a deep sliver of classical education. And so that had a really particular, specific kind of influence on the way that he spoke and wrote and thought, and then embedded with that folkiness, and I mean like real humanness, like he knew something about the world and people. Today, we may have other threats than ourselves, but in a politically polarized nation, the danger feels close. Think for yourself, and you might be able to help in bringing a critical, civil discourse to our world. And that is then the end of chapter 2 on how persuadable we are. And I then have a very useful, I'm not going to go through all this right now, maybe in another video, a really useful giant chart in here where I have notes about how to evaluate a source for avoiding disinformation, misinformation. And the categories, I basically break it down into one is targeting and location. How did you come across the information? If the information was sent to you, it was sent with purpose. It was sent, I mean, someone paid for that ad to find you in your feed. There's a reason for that. The credibility of an author or a speaker. And now there are some philosophical problems there, like with the ad hominem. We should really evaluate claims in themselves, but there's something more to be said about that concept of trust that we're discussing. Um, that's kind of our first entry point. For Aristotle thought that ethos was the most important of persuasive techniques because it works us over so easily. I put on a suit jacket and suddenly I have so much more credibility and authority and so on. The purpose of the source, why was the source created? Was there some intent? The style of the source, remember the study from the Stanford History Education Group? 96% of high school seniors didn't detect a conflict of interest in a web page published by a fossil fuel company about global warming, which is like one of the biggest conflicts of interest you could possibly have. And yet 96% of students didn't detect a conflict of interest. So there's something about the medium itself. That's a McLuhan idea, Marshall McLuhan. The medium itself can be persuasive, and as an individual, you can analyze all of those elements. The distribution mechanism. How did the information find you? Who created it, and what are their credentials, and how do they know? What tools and techniques did they use to evaluate the stuff that they're writing about and the data? I mean, if it's a scientific study, you analyze the methodology. You see if the study's been replicated. All of this. Well, good luck out there, and thank you.